Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. Today we'll be discussing what you need to know about running a charity in regards to your ACNC obligations and the duties of your responsible persons, as well as some basic good governance principles. My name is April Kitchener and presenting with me today is my colleague Chris Richards, and we are from the ACNC's education team. So I'll hand you over to Chris now, who'll take us through what we're covering today.
Thank you, April. First off, we'll give a brief overview of the obligations that registered charities have in terms of keeping their charity status and registration with the ACNC. We'll spend some time focusing on the ACNC's governance standards, particularly Governance Standard 5, which outlines the duties for responsible persons. We'll explain that term in more detail as well. In the second half of today's session, we'll go through some governance basics and some practical things you need to think about when running a charity. And as we mentioned, we'll spend the last 10 minutes or so answering some of the questions that have come through via the chat function to the group. Now I'll pass you back to April to kick things off.
Thanks, Chris. There are many obligations and responsibilities that come with running a charity, and there may be many people involved in the everyday activities of running a charity, from the board or committee to the CEO or company secretary, and of course the staff and volunteers. Ultimately though, the main people that need to understand a charity's obligations to the ACNC and in general are what we refer to as responsible persons. When we at the ACNC talk about a charity's responsible persons, we're referring to the people who are directly responsible for governing the charity. They are the members of the governing body and have ultimate responsibility for the way a charity is run and vote on decisions. So that's an ACNC term, but you might be more familiar with them as your charity's board or committee, your directors or your trustees. It is this group of individuals who together are ultimately responsible for overseeing the charity's operations and making sure it's working towards achieving its charitable purpose. It's worth noting that responsible persons may employ staff to carry out some of the day-to-day tasks of a charity, and if that occurs, the staff are responsible to and will report to the organisation's responsible persons. So we have produced a useful fact sheet on responsible persons. The link is on your screen there if you want to learn more. So when the public talk about those who run a charity, it's usually a slightly more general term which takes in a charity's responsible persons as well as those who might play a lead role in running the charity. So this might include, for example, a charity's chief executive officer or the chief operating officer. And while these positions play an important role in running a charity, for ACNC purposes though, they generally don't fit the definition of what we call a responsible person.
So we've just gone through who is responsible for governing your charity. Now it's important to understand what your charity's obligations to the ACNC actually are. Charities which are registered with the ACNC must meet 5 ongoing obligations. First is to keep charity status, that is, to remain eligible to be registered, charities must continue to be not-for-profit and pursue their charitable purpose or purposes. The second point is to keep records, that includes correct and accurate financial records and statements. The third is to report annually, and that's done by submitting an annual information statement and, for medium and large charities, a financial report every year. The fourth is to notify the ACNC of changes. This includes changes to the charity's legal name, address for service, governing documents and responsible persons. The fifth point is to meet governance standards, and that's a set of standards that charities must meet to be registered and remain registered with the ACNC. Those who are running a registered charity need to ensure their organisation complies with these obligations. You can maintain your duty to notify and reporting obligations by logging into the ACNC charity portal, and you can see the link there on the screen. That will take you right to where you need to go. Generally, these obligations are in addition to obligations your charity might have to other Commonwealth, state or territory regulators. More on these standards can be found at the ACNC website, acnc.gov.au/ongoing obligations.
Moving on to the ACNC governance standards. It is one of the obligations, so we'll just spend a bit of time going over each of the 5 governance standards. So they are a set of core minimum standards that deal with how a charity is run. The governance standards are principle-based, which basically means your charity can decide how it will comply with them. Keep in mind though that all charities, with the exception of basic religious charities, must comply with these standards. So we'll go through them. So these standards require that charities firstly be able to demonstrate that their purposes and character are not for profit and that they work towards their charitable purposes. and they also provide information about their purposes to the public. Second, charities need to take reasonable steps to be accountable to their members and provide them with adequate opportunities to raise concerns about how the charity is governed. Thirdly, charities must not commit a serious offence, such as fraud, under Australian law or breach law that may result in a penalty of 60 penalty units or more. We're not talking about a traffic infringement notice or anything like that. We're talking about the big ones. Charities must also take steps to ensure that their responsible persons are not disqualified from managing a corporation or disqualified from being a responsible person of a registered charity. And finally, charities must take reasonable steps to ensure that their responsible persons meet 7 specific duties. So you can find more of these governance standards on our website, and the link is down the bottom there. So these 7 duties that I just mentioned are important, so we'll just spend a bit more time going over those as they outline the key responsibilities that the board has to your charity.
There they, excuse me, there they are there on the screen. There's 7 of them. So we'll go through and we'll cover each one in detail. Governance Standard 5 sets down the 7 key duties that you can see there, which a charity's responsible persons must comply with. They are to act with reasonable care and diligence, act honestly and fairly in the best interests of the charity and for its charitable purposes, to not misuse their position as a responsible person, to not misuse information they gain in their position as a responsible person, to disclose conflicts of interest, to ensure the charity's financial affairs are managed responsibly, and to not allow the charity to operate while insolvent. These 7 duties provide a strong starting point to guide the actions and behaviour of those who are running a charity. Any charity registered with the ACNC must take reasonable steps to ensure that the people running the organisation know and understand these duties and comply with them. We'll now explain each of these responsibilities in more detail and what you can do to comply with these standards.
That's right. So the first duty is act with reasonable care and diligence. So joining a board means accepting a significant responsibility to the charity, its members, its beneficiaries, and also the broader community. If you are helping run a charity, you must take these responsibilities seriously. So the first duty requires a responsible person to exercise a degree of care and diligence in their role. This involves playing an active role in guiding and monitoring the charity's development and management and being aware of your obligations. You also need to stay informed about your charity. So that's the work that it's doing and the state of its finances. In addition to just knowing about these things, it's important that you also understand them. For example, if a responsible person receives key financial information about their charity, it's not enough to just read or look at the figures. There really needs to be a level of understanding that goes along with that. Other ways to comply with the standard are to read any board papers, ensure you are appropriately informed about any matter you need to make a decision on, and to be prepared for and attend board meetings on a regular basis. So I know we're all busy, but be aware that if you do miss several board meetings in a row without a compelling reason to do so, this might be seen as a breach of this duty. It's also important to remember that you can always ask for help or seek the knowledge of a professional or even the expertise of another responsible person. So for example, the treasurer when you're dealing with a charity's financial reports. But you should always take care and consider any advice that you are given and ask questions to ensure that you understand the information presented to you.
Okay, the second duty is to act honestly and in the best interests of the charity and for its purposes. So if you're in a position of responsibility at a charity, you have to remember that your first priority must be to the charity. Decisions that you make must be made from the viewpoint of the charity's best interests and what would further its work and charitable purposes. These charitable purposes are often set out in an organisation's governing documents, and that's a topic that we'll return to a little bit later in this webinar. So any personal interests or interests of other organisations need to be set aside. Your duty as a responsible person of a charity is to do the best you can on its behalf, to guide and to shepherd it so it can be the best it can be. Of course, this duty can be breached if a responsible person uses charity property to benefit another organisation, or when an action they take is one which does not further the interests and efforts of their charity.
So moving on to number 3, responsible persons must not misuse their position. So again, those in the position of responsibility to a charity need to act in the charity's best interests. Any actions which clearly run counter to this are a misuse of that position of responsibility. An example of a breach of this duty might be when someone running a charity uses their position to pay a company owned by friends or relatives, for example, when there really isn't any need to do so. No goods or services have been provided to the charity. Simply put, your role in running a charity is not to provide any benefits to yourself or to others, or to provide friends or relatives with a leg up, so to speak. It's really to ensure that the charity is doing its best to further its purposes and assist its beneficiaries. Misusing a position in this way, might not only result in a breach of the ACNC's governance standards, but could potentially lead to other serious or criminal charges being laid.
The fourth duty we're looking at is not to misuse information obtained in performing your duties. Now, most of us would be familiar with the term insider trading. That comes about when someone with confidential information about a company then illegally uses it to trade on the stock exchange to their own advantage. Along somewhat similar lines, any responsible person has a duty to ensure that sensitive or confidential information relating to the charity and its operations they help run remains in-house and is not misused. Now, some might think this duty only covers information related to a charity's finances, but it's about far more than that. Information about your charity's operations, its staffing or personnel, its future direction, even what happened at Monday night's monthly board meeting. All of this information, all of these things should be handled with discretion and respect. Sensitive charity information can carry as much value as money, and that's very important. It needs to be used properly. Not doing so can put your charity at risk or damage its reputation.
Moving on to number 5. Responsible persons must disclose any actual or perceived conflict of interest. So there's always going to be a crossover between the different part of our lives, for example, crossovers between our personal and professional or our work parts of our lives. But anyone who serves as a responsible person for a charity needs to take care that the intertwined parts of our lives don't improperly impact on the charity we serve. A common way that this can occur is when someone running a charity has a conflict between their personal interests and those of a charity, a conflict of interest. Now, for a charity's responsible persons, having a conflict of interest doesn't necessarily need to be a bad thing. The key is how they are managed. As part of their duties, responsible persons should properly address any actual or perceived conflicts of interest. This means a clear and open disclosure of any conflict between their duty to act for the charity and their personal or private interest, as well as making sure they are not part of any discussions or decision-making on a matter where there is such a conflict. So, for example, you should remove yourself from the room when these discussions take place. You should also ensure that your charity has a policy on conflicts of interest and even maintains a register of interests. Importantly, this type of approach should also be followed even if the conflict of interest is perceived rather than actual. A conflict should be disclosed whenever an independent observer could doubt that a responsible person is acting in the best interests of the charity.
The next duty we'll look at, number 6, is to ensure the charity's financial affairs are managed responsibly. Now, not everyone who is in a position of responsibility at a charity has to be a financial whiz. Of course, having a treasurer who knows their way around ledgers and financial statements is highly advisable. But for a charity's other responsible persons, there should be an expectation that they will read financial statements and that they know enough to be able to ask questions or raise concerns when they need to. They can't fly blind. Charities should also have processes in place to manage their money responsibly and to protect themselves against financial mismanagement or fraud. Again, there's more information about those issues available at the ACNC website.
And the last duty, number 7, is that you must not allow your charity to operate while insolvent. So following on from the bit Chris just went through about charities' financial affairs being managed properly, responsible persons have a duty to not allow a charity to operate while insolvent. Insolvency is when an organisation cannot pay all of its debts when they fall due. If a responsible person reasonably suspects that the charity cannot pay all of its debts when they become due, then the responsible person should take all reasonable steps to prevent the charity from taking on more debt. In addition, the charity's board should regularly review its financial position and ensure there is enough money to pay for its activities.
Cool, thank you, April. We've looked at the general good governance principles and duties, responsibilities that responsible persons have under ACNC legislation. But what about the governance practices in general? Registered charities should strive to practice good governance to ensure that their charity is effectively and properly run. A charity with good governance has strong processes as set out in their rules, and the roles and responsibilities of people within the charity are clearly understood. Doing so goes a long way towards helping ensure their organisations are well run, working effectively for the communities and people they support, and operating in a way which enhances and maintains the public's trust and confidence in both the organisation itself and, on a wider level, in the charity sector overall. Governance plays a central role in the life of charities, but how it looks in practice will vary. We'll outline a number of these general good governance principles and practices over the next half of this webinar and provide some tips for those running charities. Some of these principles may also tie into some of the ACNC's requirements for registered charities as well. We'll also highlight a number of useful resources and support materials available online which might be able to help your organisation.
Great, so meetings. One of the main examples of governance practices for charities is holding meetings to ensure that your members are kept informed about your charity's activities. So each charity will organise and run board, committee, and even subcommittee meetings in subtly different ways, depending on all sorts of variables. So this can include the type of organisation it is, its work, its stakeholders and partners, the type of people in positions of responsibility at the organisation, their relationships, for example, and how big the organisation is. Even the time of year. Some organisations will be busier at certain times of the year and may wish to meet more often to ensure things are on track and heading in the right direction. So we do have a great guide on holding meetings. We'll pop the link in the follow-up email, and we'd recommend that as a good starting point for holding meetings, especially if the responsible person is new to their role.
Linked into the issue of meetings is agendas. And agendas are a pretty key step towards a well-run meeting. Your agenda should include what is to be discussed at the meeting and the likely time for each item, who is responsible for leading the discussion on each item, and the purpose of the item being discussed. Does a decision need to be made, or is it just to be noted? Is it just for information? Is there further advice being sought, or is the matter just for discussion? Doing this work before the meeting will help ensure you invite the right people to your meeting to provide information or advice, as well as ensuring that any support material for items on the agenda is prepared and board members are well informed in advance. It will also improve the effectiveness and efficiency of any meeting, as well as provide direction to meetings, which, as we all know, can threaten to drag on for hours without any progress or resolution. Again, refer to the ACNC's guide. Again, we'll send you the links in the email that we'll send out at the end of proceedings today. There are also a number of great resources from other organisations like the Governance Institute, Justice Connect, or our community. All of them are listed or linked to on our site.
So another major part of a charity's governance is the annual general meeting. So an AGM basically sees organisations present a report to their members about how the organisation is travelling financially and what it's been doing over the past 12 months. A charity might use its AGM to make changes to its governing documents or even its name. In addition, most groups also have their board elections at the AGM, meaning a charity's responsible persons may change at this time. Those running a charity need to be aware that if they use the AGM to change its legal name, its governing document, or its responsible persons, the ACNC must be notified. And that's all done through the ACNC charity portal with that username and password, which you all should have, but if not, you can reset it online or give us a call and we can help you. So there's no specific requirements under ACNC legislation to hold an AGM. However, holding an AGM might be a good way for your charity to demonstrate that it's accountable to its members under Governance Standard 2. There's also no requirement for charities to advise of the date of your AGM or to register your upcoming AGM with the ACNC. However, you'll still need to follow any requirements around holding your AGM as set out in your governing documents, so your constitution, your model rules, articles of association, for example. It's also important to note that charities might have a number of obligations to other Commonwealth, state or territory agencies around the staging of their AGM, and that might be due to your legal structure, for example. And if that's the case, just be aware of those requirements and continue to follow them. Yep, again, we'll link you to the resource on our website, which has some information about running your AGM.
April just touched briefly on the idea of governing documents, but we'll go into a little bit more detail about them now, because it's important for responsible persons to ensure they are familiar with what these documents say and contain. Generally, governing documents are formal documents which set out the charity's charitable purpose or purposes, what it does, who it works with or helps. They also set out that the charity operates on a not-for-profit basis and the way that the charity's board or committee makes decisions or consults any members. Now, for such important documents, they're often stashed somewhere in a filing cabinet, on a shelf somewhere gathering dust. Sometimes they can even be lost or misplaced. Those who do have them often only refer to them in order to settle disputes or to quote from when filling out forms. It's important that those running a charity are not only familiar with their organisation's governing documents, but that they are regularly updated and that they are living, breathing, relevant documents that accurately reflect what your organisation is about. Remember also, the ACNC needs to be notified of any changes you make to your governing documents, as well as receiving a copy of those changed documents. We do have a fact sheet, that's acnc.gov.au/governing document. Again, we'll include that web address in the email that we send out.
Okay, so another thing to be on top of is board induction and handovers. So managing the comings and goings of charity board members and responsible persons is an important part of ensuring that the organisation continues to work effectively towards its purpose. A charity which grinds to a halt whenever a key office bearer or board member moves on or is replaced is not one that has undertaken adequate succession planning or which has appropriate change management or handover procedures. Anyone who helps run a charity has an important role in ensuring these transitions are as smooth as possible. Responsible persons should ensure there are adequate documented handover processes which help newcomers get up to speed quickly. Part of this process might be the development of a board member welcome pack, which could include your charity's policies, including a copy of the governing document that we just went through, information on important policies and procedures, and that can even include a copy of the username and password to access the portal that we touched on before, and any other documents that are relevant, such as a copy of the recent annual report. Oops. Skipped ahead there. You could also arrange for a new or incoming responsible person to shadow someone already in the position for a day, just to follow them around and learn about their role, what they do, who they work with, etc.
Next slide we'll looks at conflicts of interest, which again we've touched on already. The ACNC has a great guide on managing conflicts of interest. It's available at acnc.gov.au/conflicts of interest. Again, we'll send the link out with the email. But a charity's responsible persons need to ensure that they properly declare any actual or perceived conflict of interest. In general, the responsible person should disclose the conflict of interest to other responsible persons. If there is only one responsible person, or all of them have a conflict, then the conflict of interest should be disclosed to the members of the charity, if there are any. If none of these situations apply, we'd ask you to contact us on 132262 and have a chat and talk to us about the situation. Notably, we mention both actual and perceived conflicts of interest, and this is important. It is best practice to ensure that even the appearance of a conflict of interest is declared so that further discussions and decision-making on the issue at hand are conducted in a proper way.
Okay, the next one is responsible financial management. A key responsibility for those running a charity is to ensure their organisation has the resources it needs to carry out its work. This means a charity's responsible persons not only need to gather the resources required for the organisation to do its work, but safeguard those resources and ensure they are used in an efficient and lawful way. This covers things like reserves, budgeting, spending, and other elements of financial management. As we mentioned earlier, board and committee members should have enough financial knowledge to be able to make informed decisions on their charity's finances. Every board member must be able to read and understand a charity's financial information, as they cannot make informed decisions or ask informed questions if they don't have the knowledge to do so. This might mean you might want to seek some financial literacy training, and there are plenty of courses around. It can be useful to ask questions about your charity's treasurer, or from your charity's treasurer, to learn more if you're unsure of something. We do have a guide on managing charity money. We'll send that link out as well in the follow-up email.
Okay, our next slide looks at record keeping. And one of the key core responsibilities of registered charities is that they need to keep records. Not only does keeping records help you meet your obligations to the ACNC, but it is also good practice and will help your charity do its work efficiently and effectively. A record is a piece of information that shows your charity has operated or acted in a particular way, or has spent or received money or other assets. It might be something as simple as a receipt, a docket, proof of purchase, for example. These would be classed as financial records. Operational records would consist of documents which show how your charity is working towards its charitable purpose and how it meets its obligations under the ACNC Act, under tax law, etc. Charities have record-keeping obligations under a variety of authorities, and depending on the size of your charity, record-keeping obligations may vary. The ACNC's record-keeping obligations include your charity keeping certain written financial and operational records, keeping the records for 7 years, and keeping the records in English or in a form that can be easily translated into English. Now, those records can be kept in a format you choose as long as they are easy to find, and that you can actually develop your own system or process to keep these records as well. Now, your charity does not have to provide records to the ACNC unless asked. It is important that those running a charity know what their record-keeping obligations are and who it needs to report to. Keeping proper records has a number of other benefits for your charity. They can help show it is continuing to be run as a not-for-profit and working towards its charitable purposes, and in doing so should remain eligible to be registered as a charity. It can help it understand whether it is in good financial health, assess whether the right kinds of decisions are being made, both operational and financial. It can communicate about your charity's activities and finances. It can help you prepare reports to meet your reporting obligations to the ACNC, other government regulators, donors, funders, members of the public, and it can otherwise show that your charity meets its obligations under the ACNC Act, tax, and other relevant laws. Again, we have a couple of very useful resources on record keeping and a useful checklist as well. They'll be included in the email at the end of the webinar.
Okay, so the next item to consider is responsible fundraising. So the vast majority of charities fundraise at some stage. For those who are running a charity, ensuring that their organisation is doing everything it can to raise money responsibly and in a way that engenders public trust and confidence in their group and even the sector is paramount. Responsible persons of charities need to be across any fundraising activity their organisation is doing, not only to ensure it complies with the various regulations across Australia's states and territories, but that it's conducted responsibly. Charities in Australia, and particularly the UK, have run afoul of public opinion and the law by doing the wrong thing when asking the public for donations and support. Responsible persons should consider if their fundraising meets community expectations in a number of areas, including how they approach or engage with vulnerable people when fundraising, how they manage people's data that they gather, how they can work with fundraising agencies in a responsible way, and the challenges and opportunities of online fundraising, including donations and crowdfunding. They should also consider whether the fundraising method they're considering is the most effective and efficient one for the task at hand. We have a fundraising hub on our website, and that goes through all the different regulators when it comes to fundraising, as the ACNC doesn't actually regulate fundraising. So that's a good starting point if you're thinking of fundraising and want to find more information.
Our next slide looks at internal disputes and internal disputes handling. Now, arguments and conflicts can easily degenerate into ugly affairs, which hurt organisations, affect their reputation, and can reflect badly on the wider sector. Such disputes can be across the board table, between volunteers, between staff members, or others. The first thing to remember is that not everyone has to get along like a house on fire or be best mates. There are all manner of personalities which coexist inside charities, and not everyone has to get along all the time. However, what is important is that the work of the charity, its charitable purposes, remains paramount. People can coexist or perhaps not even get along all the time, but once this starts to impact on the charity as a whole, then the situation becomes a problem. It is a good idea to set in place policies on how to handle disputes, how to arbitrate them, as well as dispute resolution procedures and techniques. Those running a charity should be familiar with these procedures, but they should also be prepared to intervene where required or even refer things onwards to other authorities. Finally, don't run into trouble with related issues like bullying or harassment. This can see your charity hit legal trouble and its reputation take a hit too. I think April's going to have a quick chat or touch on some of those issues in the next slide.
Yeah, so the next slide covers staff and volunteers. So we've got some figures there. It might be interesting to a lot of you to hear that charities actually employ over 1.2 million staff. That's 10% of Australia's workforce, second only behind the retail industry, I believe. Further to that, 4 out of 5 charities engage volunteers, and that's 3 million volunteers overall. So if this is the case for your charity, there's a few things you might need to ask yourself. Do you have policies on volunteer management or staff management? Do you have approaches that cover any allegations of bullying or harassment, OH&S safeguards, volunteer or staff recruitment, internal dispute resolution, and even discrimination? Even policies or procedures covering how you manage staff and volunteers when staging fundraising or special events is something you need to consider. Charity staff and volunteers are in many ways the lifeblood of an organisation. Harnessing their passion and commitment to your cause is vital, and that's in addition to ensuring they are looked after. A charity's responsible persons should ensure that anyone working for or volunteering with their organisation is looked after. And that includes them being covered and protected by adequate policies and procedures, that their efforts are being respected and appreciated by the organisation, and that they of course feel a part of the organisation, that they are welcomed with a good induction and are clear on their role and are led well. It's also important to remember that your charity will have different legal obligations depending on if someone is an employee, volunteer, or even a contractor. And it may sound obvious, but if your charity is thinking of taking on employees, they'll also need to be paid and paid properly, and that includes contributions to their superannuation and money to cover for leave entitlements and for resources they might need to do their job. So we've mentioned this many times before, that we do have some resources covering how charities should work with volunteers and employees, and we'll send those links to you all as well.
Now, of course, all of this, all of what we've mentioned in the webinar, it isn't an all-encompassing list, but it is a general guide which is designed to help those running a charity to cover bases, be aware of what they need to do, be aware of general good governance practice, and to lead them to resources which can help them in their roles. Many charities will have unique individual requirements, but having a solid foundation of knowledge, policy and procedure, and an awareness of your responsibilities can go a long way towards helping your responsible people fulfill their roles successfully, confidently, and in a way that helps your charity achieve what it sets out to do. As you can see here, we've got some of those links that we've talked about. We will forward the rest of them to you. Now, this is the end of the formal presentation today. What we'll do now is we'll open it up to questions. Now, we've already got a couple by the looks of it, which we might quickly jump onto. It says having a quick look. The first one that we've got is asking about registering for tax deductible donations, which is probably something that responsible persons, board members should be aware of, particularly if they're either new to the role or if they're got a new charity or a new organisation going. What we'll do, we'll have a quick look. There are organisations that are eligible for tax concessions, and they are classed as DGRs, so deductible gift recipients. It's important to know that not all charities are eligible for this endorsement. Not all charities are able to be endorsed as DGRs. The ATO has several categories of DGR, in fact. A charity needs to fit one of these categories to be endorsed, and not all charities will fit into a DGR category. How it works is that the ACNC, that's us, assesses an organisation to find out whether it is a charity. Once that's done, we pass the details to the ATO, the tax office, to endorse the charity for tax concessions it is eligible for. Certain types of charities are eligible for a DGR endorsement, but most are not. Again, we'll provide a link to the ATO's categories in the follow-up email after the webinar. I think we might have another question by the looks.
Yeah, so a question has come through from a new board member, it looks like, of a smaller charity, asking about the reporting requirements relating to their particular small charity. So we touched a little bit on the reporting requirements of charities, but yeah, this is a good chance to go into it a little bit more. So all charities, regardless of their size, must submit an annual information statement, unless, of course, they're registered with ORIC, which is the Office of the Registrar of Indigenous Corporations, who just need to report to that regulator. So the annual information statement, it includes questions about a charity's activities, what it's done throughout the year, and also asks for some financial information as well. How much information you provide to us will depend on your size. So for small charities, so this charity here, they won't need to provide us with any sort of financial statements, just answer the basic financial questions in the form. So that's some figures from their profit and loss statement, for example. Medium and large size charities though, they do need to submit an annual financial report on top of those financial questions in the annual information statement, and that either needs to be reviewed or audited depending on their size. Small charities can do this if they want, but it's not compulsory. But if they do, that information will be displayed on the register along with the rest of the annual information statement. Okay, so there's another question, Chris, I guess following on from that question about reporting requirements. Is there a requirement to have the financial reports audited?
Yeah. Look, again, it depends on the size of your charity. If your charity is small, there's no ACNC requirement to have financial reports audited. But that changes if your charity is medium in size. The ACNC requires that you have financial reports either reviewed or audited, and there are some requirements on who can actually perform these tasks to ensure that they're done properly. If your charity is large, you have to have the financial reports audited. We have a good resource at acnc.gov.au/review audit, which will help you out and spell out the specifics of what you have to do depending on the size of your charity. Now we've got one here. Looks like someone who might be a volunteer or working with the charity. They're involved in a charity, but they're interested in becoming a board member, and they're asking what should they think about before perhaps jumping onto the board. First up, good on you for trying to jump on the board. Well done. Yeah, exactly right. But in saying that, there is a lot to think about in taking on a role on the board. Most importantly, you should probably think about whether or not you have the time to do so. You know, you need to make time for those meetings. You need to take the time to be aware of the charity's happenings. And a lot of the time, you're probably going to be doing it on a volunteer basis on top of your regular, you know, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 job. So it's important to think about whether or not you have the time and resources to devote enough of your energy into the charity and its purposes and its beneficiaries. So yeah, just have a think about realistically about the time and effort you could devote to doing the job properly. We've gone through a lot of the obligations and responsibilities that responsible persons need to be on the ball of. So yeah, that's something you need to take into consideration. So yeah, by all means, we do encourage you to take up positions on the board. It's a rewarding and fulfilling position to be involved in, but just consider what impact that will have on the rest of your obligations that you might have outside of the charity and whether or not you can balance the two. Another good idea might be too, if you're part of an organisation and they know you're familiar with them, you should perhaps feel free to wander up to someone who might be a board member or someone who might be a responsible person, and just to say to them, hey, look, you know, I might be interested in jumping on board here. what are some of the things that this organisation would require of me to ensure that I'm doing the job properly? What sort of time and effort would you expect? Or, you know, all that sort of information, so that you're jumping on and you're fully informed.
Absolutely, do your research.
Yeah. The worst thing that anyone can do, and by no means are we saying don't join a board, because that's like the last thing we want to do. Board members are usually, prospective board members are usually welcomed with open arms, but there's few things worse than if someone wishes to jump on board but can't actually offer the level of commitment that's required, because that can actually cause problems, and that can actually cause issues on the board. It can do more harm than good if you're not doing it quite right. So if you can't put aside the level of commitment that's perhaps required, be honest with yourself and have a bit of a think about whether you should be joining the board, or whether you should just stay in the position you are as a volunteer perhaps, or if perhaps there might be some other position or some other role that you can play that better suits what you're able to offer.
Great, thanks Chris. So we've probably got time for one or two more. There's a question here about someone wanting to know where they can increase their financial literacy. Where can they get more information or any sort of training? Anything that you can think of, Chris?
Look, there's a few organisations around. There's some that maybe include the CPA, the CAANZ, Accounting for Good is another. There are a number of organisations that offer these types of tailored training, and they're tailored to not-for-profit or not-for-profit board members or charity board members. Again, we have a link on our website, which we'll again send to people at the end of the webinar today. But also, I mean, even if you are familiar with these organisations, go to their websites, have a look. If you are on the board, your fellow board members, your CEO, your treasurer may have links or information on organisations that offer this type of training. Have a word to them as well. Now we're getting lots of questions through, and Matt, who is working behind the scenes to answer them, is typing like crazy actually. Now we are not going to be able to answer all of your questions straight up right now, but what we will do, all these questions that you've sent through get saved, and we retain them, and what we can do is we can answer them via email as a follow-up. So feel free to ask your questions, send it through to us. If we don't get to you straight away, Matt will be typing away still for another 10 or so minutes after we wrap up. And beyond that, we will get back in touch with you with some responses to your questions afterwards in the coming couple of days.
Yeah, so on that note, that's probably about all we have time for today. Thank you to everyone for joining us and for sending your questions through. And apologies again, and thanks for your patience for those technical difficulties we had earlier on. Like Chris mentioned, we'll hang around for a little bit longer online just to answer as much of those questions that we can. But if not, we will get back to you one way or another. I'll just mention again that we are always looking to improve our education products. So if you can take the time to complete the survey, we would really appreciate that. Or if you have any additional comments or questions about the webinar, you can get in touch with the